muscle fizz? Actin and myosin.
Yeah.
Well, the actin and myosin fibers have little ratchets, and when they contract, they ratchet against each other. But the problem is you can't relax a muscle without calcium. And you end up getting tetany in the muscle and terrible muscle cramps. So if you do get muscle cramps, take calcium. And that's why pregnant women have a terrible time with cramps, because the fetus is stealing their calcium. So they have to up that. So calcium is very important. One other thing before we get into this, and this is a really important thing because it plays a role in everything, and that is melanocytes. Yeah, they're neural crest cells. You know, I have this problem with neural crest cells. I just love neural crest cells. But they're they form the melanocytes, and those are the pigment tissues that you'll see in people's mouth. If you look at your dog, you'll see pigment in his mouth or her mouth, and that's because they have an antimicrobial effect. That's one thing. But here's what I want to get, and this is really important, and they should teach this to every third grader on the planet Earth. Well, hell, teach it in the 4th grade too, so they get it for sure. Skin color. Skin color. Why do we have different skin color? It's melanocytes, folks, that's all. Why do we have it? Well, if you remember, we're all Africans. We've only been out of Africa for 60, 80,000 years. That isn't very long. So we're all Africans, and we all start out with dark skin. The reason you want dark skin in Africa is because the UV light is so intense that what happens is it breaks down through your skin, it breaks down folic acid. And if you don't have enough folic acid, what happens? Terrible, terrible birth defects. Basically, your whole neural system is a problem. You have these things like severe spina bifida and anencephaly and those kind of things because you didn't have enough folic acid. Now, when you move away from Africa, then what happens? Well, it's not because there's too much sunlight and what's more, it gets cold and you put on clothing. It's that you don't have enough sunlight. And where do you get vitamin D? Through your skin. The sun creates vitamin D in your skin. It processes it through the liver, but it doesn't matter, but that's how you get it. If you don't get enough vitamin D, what happens? Rickets and osteomalacia. Because you can take all the calcium you want, but if you don't take vitamin D with it, you can't process it. It won't cross your gut. That's why they put vitamin D in milk, for that very reason. So vitamin D, when you work away from the equator, you have to lighten your skin to get more vitamin D. That's all it is, folks. There's nothing weird about it. Skin color is just an adaptation. But you know, here's the thing that worries me most of all. If you don't have a scientific explanation for it, what happens when Tommy, who's in the 3rd grade or 2nd grade, goes home and says, Mom, I noticed that my best friend Richard has different color skin than I do. Why? You know what his mom's going to tell him? You know what she's going to tell him? Going to make up some kind of a story about towers of Babel and people on arks and this and that and God. It's some crazy story. Well, it's not a crazy story. It's just simple. So those are melanocytes that do it, and the whole thing ties in with bones and bone structure. Now, one other thing. We'll talk about this. If you covered Wolff's Law, okay, Wolff's Law, Wolff was an anatomist in the 1800s, a German anatomist, and he came up with this idea that if you stress bone, it will hypertrophy. In the absence of stress, it will atrophy. That's why the astronauts are constantly checking their bone mineral, constantly. Because they're dumping calcium like crazy because there's no gravity and the bones don't feel the stress, and boom, what happens? They dump all their calcium. So they're constantly monitoring that. And the guy who holds the record for being up the longest, that Russian guy, he lost 12% of his bone mass and he never got it back. They have to carry these guys off the shuttle because they're afraid they're going to break their bones. That's how important this is. Now, Wolff's Law this is what I want to get across, only works when you're a kid. Once you're an adult, it stops working. When you're a kid, you're replacing all of your bones through modeling. You're replacing them essentially every other year. Once you hit adulthood, at about 21, 22, it's over. Your bones are fused and you can't change them. Even the great big weightlifters, and even guys, the big bodybuilders, that have arms this big, the size of a gorilla, they can't produce the force and they don't have bones that are strong enough to do it, which is why they break bones. And here's one other, before I'll start the slideshow, here's a dirty little secret. Swimming. I was a swimmer in college. You know what they don't tell you? They don't tell you that swimming, you can swim 6 hours a day, which is what a good swimmer does, but that you're in essentially a zero gravity, a neutral gravity environment, and you don't build bones. So swimmers have a terrible time with osteoporosis, which is why they now do something called dry land, because they're trying to stop the lack of bone. But I got to meet, did you get to meet, what's his name from Australia, the torpedo?
Oh, I think so, yeah.
What is his name?
Ian.
He's short of Michael Phelps, the greatest swimmer there's ever been. And I got to meet him, and he has a terrible time. He broke his humerus, he broke his shoulder, because he has osteoporosis. And nobody ever told him that. So anyway, take-home message is, if you were a swimmer, a competitive swimmer, don't think you have strong bones. You might want to have your bone mineral checked. One other thing, remember, you can build strong bones until you hit adulthood. When you hit 22, you've maxed out your bone mineral. You cannot add to it after that. You can't. You can slow it down with really, really heavy-duty exercise. But when I say really heavy-duty, I mean it. The only exercise they found that can reduce bone loss is floor gymnastics. I don't think 65-year-old women can do floor gymnastics, folks. But they can help it if they pump iron. That'll slow it down. But anyway, you can't add to it. So, those of you that aren't 22, you've only got a couple years to build bone mass. Get out there and do it. Once you fuse those bones, it's over. I know. Aging sucks. Okay, I'm going to just zip through this simply because I want to do the bones first. We'll do all this other stuff next time. The enamel prisms. All right. Cartilage and bones. If it says chondro, that means cartilage. It's Latin for cartilage. So if you've got chondrocytes, you've got all sorts of things that end in chondral. That just means cartilage. If it's osteo, that's bone. So osteoblasts form bone. Periosteum is a membrane that surrounds bone. So you can sort of figure those things out. Chondroblasts form cartilage. And cyte just refers to a cell. This is a typical synovial joint. From the neck down, this is what drives your body. And the key here is, and this is a major breakthrough, hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is wonderful stuff. Mammals use it. Dinosaurs didn't have it. And even things like crocodiles don't really have it. They have fibrocartilage, which has a much higher coefficient of friction. It's rough. But in mammals, we have hyaline cartilage, which is really slippery. Its coefficient of friction is essentially nil. There's nothing on the planet that we have that comes even close to it. Teflon, STP, anything you want, doesn't come close to how slippery hyaline cartilage is. But there's a problem with it. And the problem is this. It's avascular. That means it's extremely limited in thickness. If you damage cartilage, and I'll bet some people in here have damaged your knees, that's a real common problem. If you damage hyaline cartilage, folks, it isn't going to repair. You're cooked. That's it. They can go in and clip out the menisci, they can go in and clip out the little pieces that are causing your knee to lock up, but it isn't going to fix it. And by the time you're 40 or 50, you'll have osteoarthritis. So hyaline cartilage is non-renewable. And it can only be 3 millimeters thick. Even in an elephant, it's 3 millimeters thick. And in a mouse, it's 3 millimeters thick. It can't get any thicker because of this problem. It doesn't like the vascular system. It doesn't like blood. Which if you hurt a joint, the first thing the MD is going to do is look at the joint and see if you bled into it. Because if you bled into it, that's trouble. You have to get that blood out of there because cartilage and blood don't like each other. Now what holds it all in? Well, they're just, you line these things in hyaline cartilage, you put in a fluid inside of this system, and the fluid is synovial fluid, and that's how most of the joints work. The one you've got to worry about is the temporomandibular joint. That's a little weird. Temporomandibular joint is part hyaline cartilage, but part fibrocartilage, which tells you that you're not worried so much about friction in your TMJ. What you're worried about is its ability to tolerate compression, because that's what fibrocartilage can do. Fibrocartilage is just stuff in your ears. It can tolerate compression, it can tolerate moving around. Hyaline can't, it's very sensitive. And this is just the tissue types. You've got, what we're talking about today are cartilage and bone. It's connective tissue. Epithelium isn't really a tissue type. It's a architecture. Epithelia are made up of cuboidal cells. And we'll be talking about cuboidal cells a lot and how they depolarize and all that stuff. But they're just like, imagine shoeboxes lined up next to each other, and they sit on top of a basement membrane. That's what epithelium is like. And it lines, your lungs, your gut, all over the place. Muscle tissue, nervous tissue, we got that. Muscle is mesoderm, got that. Nervous tissue is ectoderm, got that. Cartilage forms the basis of essentially all the bones in your body. Now there's two types of bone, basically. One is called endochondral. Endochondral bone is like your arm bone or your femur or your radius or your ulna. That kind of bone comes from a cartilaginous model that then ossifies. There's a cartilaginous model. The one you got to worry about is membranous bone. Membranous bone are head bones. Everything except the occipital. The occipital is not. That is an endochondral bone. It doesn't react like the rest of the skull. And I told you that's because we stole the occipital from the vertebral column. But the rest of the things, the parietals and the frontal bone and all the bones in your face, those are all membranous bones. And they don't have a cartilaginous model. They ossify between the membranes. The pericardium, or perichondrium, that surrounds them, they ossify within the pericardium, so they don't have a cartilaginous model. It's kind of a sloppy way to decide what makes up bones, but that's all we got. Because if you really want to know, endochondral also is membranous. But let's not get involved in that. This just shows where the tissue comes from. You already know that probably. Cartilage is connective tissue. Cartilage has a lot of water in it, so it's squishy. That's good. And it's hydrophilic, so it attracts water. And that's why when you move, you squish the cartilage, you push the liquid out of it, and then when you move the joint, it runs back in. So that's a way that it's compliant. But it cannot absorb stress. And the reason it can't, actually it could if you could make it thicker. But if it's 3 millimeters, you can't absorb stress. So Anybody that tells you that cartilage is a stress absorber, tell them this. Okay, stand on the chair, jump off the chair, and land straight knee. Don't worry, because that cartilage will take up all that stress. Oh, like hell it will. You'll crack your enamel. Come on, we all know you can't do that. That'd be crazy. Something takes up that stress. It's the muscles of your leg that take it up when you bend your knees. Your quadriceps is what takes up the stress. Muscles absorb energy as well as contracting. Cartilage cannot do that. How does it grow? This is something you want to know. 2 types of growth. And this occurs in bones, this occurs in, not so much teeth, but it occurs in your mandible and your maxilla. One is that appositional growth. That's where you add to the outside of the bone. And you make it bigger and bigger. That's fine, you got that figured out pretty easy. The other one is interstitial. Interstitial growth is when you create more cells within the membrane and you create it like that. So you've got appositional growth and interstitial growth. Chondrocytes can grow interstitially. Bone cannot. And the reason bone can't is that its matrix becomes mineralized, and then those poor little osteoblasts, which turn into osteocytes, the bone cells, get trapped in the matrix and they can't get out. So you have a problem with keeping them alive, so you have aversion systems, we'll see in a minute. But you can't grow bone interstitially because there's no place for it to grow. It has to be appositionally. Bones are made up of collagen, primarily type 1 collagen, which makes up most of the connective tissue of your body. Although now there's, I think there's 22 different kinds of collagen. So the organic matrix of a bone is protein, it's collagen. It also has inorganic material, and that's what makes it stiff. And that is the hydroxyapatite, which is primarily calcium and phosphate. So it's about 65%, depending on where it is and what bone it is, 65% mineralized. So it'll take up a little bit of force because stress, simply because it has a collagen in it, but it can't take up much because it's too brittle. All right, bone formation. We talked about endochondral when you have a cartilaginous model. Intramembranous, where you have, it's just like bones in your skull, the plates in your skull. And then sutural, which is basically what we're talking about, intramembranous. The bones in your skull grow at the sutures. They accrete bone on the edge of the sutures, and that's how, as your brain expands and your eyeballs get bigger, that's how the bone can expand out. But it's important to know that intramembranous bone can tolerate that kind of a stress. Intrachondral can't. In bone types, you have cortical bone, which is the heart of the outside of a bone, the ivory part. And trabecular bone, which we'll see in a second, sometimes called cancellous bone. That's the network underneath a joint. Yeah.
So the intramembranous and sutural bone are both in the skull, but what's the difference between them?
One more time.
You said the intramembranous bone and the sutural bone are both in the skull?
The only intramembranous bone, all of the bones in your skull are intramembranous, and they grow between these membranes at the pericardium that surrounds them. And they start ossifying within that membrane, and then it expands out to the sutures. The endochondral, the only bone in your skull that's endochondral is your occipital bone. Because that, we had to create a neck, and that's where we created the neck.
So the sutural bone is like part of the...
Sutural is really just a form of bone formation in an intramembranous bone. Because that's where the two plates meet. And as you pull them apart because your brain's expanding, you start to accrue bone at this suture. Kind of a those two go together. Woven bone is when you break a bone. It's high in collagen, a lot of protein. It's extremely well vascularized, but it remodels very quickly. And it goes back to being cortical bone. So that's that collar that you form around the break. But in your case, and you want to know this, most bone people do not divide, say, your mandible and your maxilla. You have down here at the bottom of your mandible, you have cortical bone. On top of it, where the teeth are sitting, you have alveolar bone. And alveolar bone, histologically, is woven bone. But the trick here is alveolar bone never remodels. It stays forever young. It stays highly mineral, or not highly proteinish. It's extremely well vascularized, and that's why you can move teeth around in orthodontics. Because it's young bone and you can push things all around. If that was cortical bone, it'd be in there and you couldn't do it. So in the human, not just humans, in all mammals, we have this alveolar bone, which is, you can consider to be woven bone. It is under a microscope, that looks like woven bone. And this is just a type of bone you have. You know, you've got irregular bones and flat bones and long bones and da-da-da-da. You know, we kind of know that. Okay, in a flat bone, like your skull, you've got this stuff in the middle called diplo. Now, if that was on the inside of a long bone, you would call it trabecular bone. But in a flat bone, you don't. You call it diplo. And you have an external table and an internal table, and then the diplo is in the middle. And in a human, in an adult human, and in a child as well, you've got hemopoietic tissue in there that forms blood. You probably know that when you're forming blood as a kid, almost all your bones have blood-forming tissue. As you age, it comes into your central skeleton, your axial skeleton, and you're left with, as an adult, your pelvis, your vertebra, and your skull. And that's really the only thing that's still making blood. And this is this femur that's been sectioned. And I just want to see the stuff inside. That's a trabecular bone. And then on the outside here, you've got what's called subchondral bone, which just means under cartilage. And when you look at a bone, the smooth surface of the joint, that's called subchondral bone. And if you think about it, it's extremely thin, paper thin. And when you do your dissections, if you have a chance, you can take a scalpel, or even through your gloves, don't take off your gloves, but you can take your fingernail and push it, and you can feel the give on a joint. And that's there to absorb energy to protect the hyaline cartilage, and that's why you've got the trabecula in there. Now the problem is trabecular bone, although it has the same amount of mineralization as cortical bone, because it's so much smaller, it has a much, much higher surface area. You're talking about 10 times the surface area. Now when you start to lose bone due to aging, to osteoporosis, and that occurs after 22, you're losing anyway, but in women when you hit menopause, call it 45 or 50, what happens is your ovaries stop producing estrogen, and that's the anabolic steroid. You can no longer build bone, and what happens is you drop off really fast. Men follow a decade or two later. But women, that's a real problem with menopause because it creates osteoporosis. And only humans get osteoporosis. Only humans undergo menopause. Except, as I told you, maybe whales, but I don't know about that. I have no idea. Who would know? But at any rate, that's a real issue in human health. And what happens is you lose the trabecular bone really quickly because of the surface area. And that's the cortical bone right here. That's the hard stuff. Holds you up. Now, in an endochondral bone, you have growth plates. And remember, it's one you don't. You have sutures at the edge of it, and that's where you get growth. In an endochondral bone, you have a growth plate. And the growth plate, and there's a good reason that we did this. Well, we didn't choose to do it, but evolution did this. Because if you want to have a complex joint, you can't build it with fibrocartilage. And you can't build it with just a straight bone. Which is why, as big as they were, dinosaurs could not run 50 miles an hour. I don't care what anyone says. They would shear through their joints in a second. If you weigh 6 tons like a T-Rex, and you accelerate that 6 tons to 40 miles an hour, how are you going to stop? Think about it. Like, oh my God, I see a tree 100 yards away. Slow down, slow down. I mean, come on. We know what the coefficient of friction is between skin and the ground. You can figure that out. You couldn't do it. You can't stop. So all that Jurassic Park stuff is. The little ones could run around like ostriches. That's fine. But the big guys weren't running around. They were being super careful because they had fibrocartilaginous joints. I don't even know how they could walk downhill without shearing through their joints. Obviously they did, but I don't know how. You know how many dinosaur people have asked that? You know what they always say? Dinosaur people, paleontologists, they always say, well, I don't know, but obviously they could. Well, that's what kind of answer is that? You know, another one. Okay, you've got those sauropods that have necks that are 30 foot long. Now, and heads that are this big, heads that are smaller than a horse's head. And they were eating crappy food. I mean, they were eating bad food. There was no deciduous trees. They were eating pine trees, for God's sake. How much calories are you getting out of that? So they had to be eating all day. I still don't know how they did it, how they got so big. But here's the thing. If you've got a column that's 30 foot long, and you've got nostrils this big, and we know how big their nostrils are, then how do you clear that column of bad air? How do you get fresh air in? Think about it. How do you get all that bad air out so you can inhale and get it back in? That's 30-foot column of air. And you ask them, I don't know, but they sure did it. I know, I'm serious about this. I think they had a tracheotomy. I really do. And that's how they did it. And that they were breathing through this thing, and then when they wanted to make noise, they'd close it, and then they could make dinosaur noises. Whatever they're doing. You can see when I go to Jurassic Park, I'm not fun to sit with. Because it's always like, oh, that's bullshit. You can't say that. Okay, now back to the bone. Here we have the bone shaft, and the bone shaft is called the diaphysis. Then we have the growth plate, the secondary growth plate out here, called the epiphysis. So you have a diaphysis, the shaft, a secondary growth plate that's the epiphysis, and in between them is a layer of cartilage called the physis. You can see epiphysis, diphysis. Well, and then at the on the shaft where it expands out to meet the joint, that's called the metaphysis. I know, it's diaphysis, epiphysis, metaphysis, and physis. Now the reason we did that is if we can do something, mammals can do something that other animals can't do, and not all mammals can. Your dog can't do it. Your cat can't do it. But you know what you and I can do as primates? We can do this. We can circumduct our arms and our legs because we have a ball and socket joint. Hey, that's a pretty cool thing to do. Go home and take your dog and try to do that. No, don't take your dog. Take the cat. Take the cat. It's okay. No, don't hurt the kitty. But anyway, they can't do this. And they can't do this. That's a climbing adaptation. But in order to make a complex joint to enable you to do that, you had to build them because the joint has to grow at a different rate than the rest of the bone. And in order to do that, you have to have its own growth center. And that's why you have this epiphysis. You know, there's a diaphysis, the shaft. It's lined in trabecular bone underneath the joint. That's the subchondral bone up there. You have a nutrient foramen that goes in, and the reason that nutrient foramen is important is that's where you start ossifying in the shaft. So you fuse these epiphyseal lines as adults. Each bone fuses at a slightly different time. That's a forensic tool that you can use. If you find a skeleton, you can, and it's a subadult, you can, within reason, use its teeth and also use its bones to tell how old it is. Yeah, same old thing. Trabecular bone, that's the diaphysis, that's the epiphysis, that's the nutrient foramen, and it's all lined on the outside of a long bone is the periosteum. That's the membrane. On the inside of the bone, there's another membrane called the endosteum. The endosteum lines the inside, and it's very thin. Periosteum is not. Periosteum is pretty strong stuff, and that is a osteogenic. It can create more bone when you're young. It's also when you're eating ribs. I know, when I bring up food, everybody else is like, don't turn it into food. It is going to ruin my life. I know. If you're eating ribs and you get that little thing and you go, yeah, and it like the membrane tear, that's a periosteum. It's also extremely well vascularized, and it has a neural complex that's very sensitive, and when you break a bone, that's what hurts, is the periosteum being ripped. Oh, what do you know? Periosteum. That's on the outside, endosteum is on the inside. Endosteum is really hard to see. Periosteum is nice, thick stuff you can see. Now, when you're growing bones, you can't, it just doesn't isometrically expand. Because if it did, your bones would look really weird. You have to change them. You don't want your femoral shaft to be this big around. They look like an elephant. You don't want it to be like that. You want it to be big on the ends at the joints, so when it's growing like this, you're growing bone under the epiphysis, because you lay down cartilage, and the cartilage then ossifies, and it forms cartilaginous tubes that then ossify, and as it grows, it ossifies behind it, and that moves the epiphysis up or down, depending where you are. Now, what are you doing behind it? You can't just let it stay the same, so you have to have osteoclasts. Osteoblasts are what form bone. Anything is blast forms. Osteoclast removes bones. So what happens is, in a bone like this, you have to go in, as this thing grows, osteoclasts come in and behind it and eat that bone away. They remodel it, or if it's original, they model it. And that's why you don't have bones that have funny shapes. Well, they are pretty funny, but notwithstanding that, that's why bones have the shape they do, is because as you grow in this direction, you also are having to remove bone down here. Otherwise, it would be really thick. And your body doesn't want to have bones that are too thick because they take too much energy to move. You could have bones that would never break. But if you did that, they'd weigh a ton, and then it would take too much energy. So there's a trade-off all the time. That's also why when you don't stress your bones like the astronauts, the bones say, hey, we're not getting stressed, let's dump all this mineral. And they do. Which is another, and this has no gender feeling at all. I just would say that before you go sending women into space for long periods of time, ask yourself, until we solve osteoporosis, they're in trouble. Much more trouble than men, because they start out with less bone mass and then they lose it faster. So I don't think women should be going to Mars until we solve this osteoporotic thing. And it's a big, big problem. I worked on a project at the Cleveland Clinic. This is a huge project. This is multi-million-dollar stuff. And we were trying to figure out how to stop people from losing bone mass. And it was all about NASA. NASA gave us all the money. And how do we stop this? Man, we tried everything. We had people on treadmills. Of course, you start on a treadmill. Then we had people on bikes. That didn't seem to work. Then we had people, we put treadmills on the wall. So you would be your feet against the wall and try that. I don't know why we tried it, but we thought that may be something. And we tried it. We tried, pumping iron. We tried everything. It didn't slow it down. It didn't. And we took poor little rats and we put poor little rats in things that have reduced gravity. You can spin them around. It's really sad for rabbits. But anyway, we did the rabbits too. Someday I'll tell you my rabbit story. But at any rate, we couldn't stop it. So at the end of the day, spending millions of dollars, do you know what we came up with? This is embarrassing. And that's what they're still using today. You take a piece of Teflon, it's like this big, and then you take bungee cords like you buy at CVS. The whole darn thing probably costs $5, and you hook it on the belt, and they run on the Teflon. It didn't work, but it was the cheapest thing we could come up with. It's better than a treadmill up there. So osteoporosis is a big problem. That's just my little story about osteoporosis. Someday I'll tell you the bunny story. It was my job to try to exercise bunnies. Now, has anybody here ever had a bunny as a pet? I mean, come on, they're nice. I have no problem with bunnies, but you can't make them exercise. First, I got a wheel, like a hamster wheel. I said, put them on the wheel, and they won't run. They just sit there. So then I put a little motor on the wheel, to make them run. And what they do, bunnies just sit there, and then the wheel goes, and they just go, and they don't run or anything. So it's like, okay, bunnies are outsmarting me. So then I figured, I came up with this thing like, actually, I got the idea at the supermarket where you put your, the belt, a conveyor belt thing. And I got one of those and I put them on the conveyor belt, and then they sit on the conveyor belt until it hits where it goes down, and they get their little bunny paws caught there. Oh yes, terrible. It was awful. It was awful. And you think, bunnies, if you would just run, you wouldn't do that. Well, they don't. They just do that. So then I said, okay, I'm going to put little electrodes, just little electrodes. Nothing strong. Don't look at me like I'm sick. And we put little electrodes there, and then the bunnies would go up there and it'd shock them, and they'd jump back like this far, and then you hit it again and jump back, and hit it again. Like, bunnies, you're not getting this, man. So, this is really embarrassing. So in order to exercise the bunnies, we put them in a room, and it was my job to chase them around. I had to chase bunnies with a broom. How embarrassing. My father, he never got that. All right. Bone remodeling. Bone remodeling. Remember, osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts break it down. So when you break down an osteoclast, you have this little hole in it. If you look at bone that's big,